What's up everyone, it's ENDYMION, and today we're going back to the lands of Dungeons & Dragons as key players have been removed from the franchise and replaced with new talking heads. Is this a good thing, or will it get even worse, and Stellar Blade bends the knee to ESG? Could this mean that developer Shift Up has been compromised and the eventual sequel will be a westernized woke nightmare? Firstly, Dungeons & Dragons. As I previously reported a few videos back, the 50th anniversary book has come out for D&D. And it was riddled with woke weirdos attacking the creators of D&D, calling them misogynistic and old white men. This obviously didn't go over well for the fandom, and many people were appalled that Wizards of the Coast, which owns D&D and Baldur's Gate sub-franchises, could go about doing this. To spit in the faces of the great men who created such an IP to begin with, it was considered sacrilegious by many, and for good reason. Also, a few videos ago, I spoke about one of the heads of Wizards of the Coast going out of their way to say that white men must be eliminated from the hobby altogether, and it can't come soon enough. In case you don't know the person I'm talking about, his name is Kyle Brink. He has infamously stated that white people in general are the devil when it comes to pretty much any hobby that is out there, or property for that matter. And that it is up to him and others in positions of power to shift the rights of who gets to decide how things change in the future, basically meaning that he and others are trying to make every property and company change hands so that only people of diversity and whatnot are in charge in the future. Kyle Brink infamously was on a podcast called Three Black Halflings channel where he said, and I will briefly quote, "This is not the face of the hobby anymore, and I think that there's been mistakes made in years past where people assumed that Dungeons & Dragons players were all, white dudes in a basement, which has been a faulty assumption for a lot of years and gets more and more false every year, and so in my viewpoint, guys like me can't leave soon enough," end quote. So like I said, this Kyle guy is yet another pathetic woke white guy who has been conditioned by those around him to believe that he is somehow the evil that must be uprooted from this world, and he claims in the same interview that he works every day at Wizards in order to hire people that he calls smarter and better than he is in order to run the show. Everything this guy says or does is to worship diversity and denounce his white privilege, apparently. Well, it looks like Kyle finally got his wish, because it seems recently corners of the Dungeons & Dragons fandom has confirmed that Kyle Brink no longer works at Wizards of the Coast anymore. As we can see here on his LinkedIn profile, it clearly states that Kyle is now a former executive producer. We don't know if he was fired or if he stepped down. I'm sure that we'll learn more about this as the days and weeks pass, but for now, this woke lunatic is gone from Wizards officially. This isn't the only high-profile departure from Wizards this year either, since Cynthia Williams, who was the president of Wizards, also left the company back in April. So, what's going on exactly? Well, it looks like a combination of hubris meets unrealistic expectations with a heavy dose of laziness, if we're being honest here. This article from GeekWire beautifully articulates exactly why Wizards' current downfall is happening, and it is pretty damning the more I read all the information that is available here. Basically, Wizards back in the early 2000s allowed their brands to be used under OGL, or Open Game License. This allowed other companies and even independents to effectively use similar concepts or downright steal ideas from Wizards of the Coast brands for free to use for their own games, tabletops, and so on. This is also why you have things like podcasts and more being created where they downright utilize D&D as a base and then go their own way without really owning Wizards a penny. You probably know about Critical Role. It's a similar situation here as well. Everything that has come out of Critical Role, even the animated shows, they are heavily inspired by D&D as a concept, obviously. But the OGL makes it so that none of this is technically within the grounds of legal lawsuits, so pretty much anybody can do whatever they want and get away with it. You may ask yourself, why the hell would Wizards allow this? Wouldn't they make more money and be more prominent if they just clutched their pearls harder and refused all of this from happening? Maybe, but according to this report from Polygon back in 2019, Wizards still had a market share over tabletop gaming of around 51% of the time. And no other single tabletop game that was similar had an audience that was anywhere equal to even 10% of what Wizards' total audience was at the time. So pretty much, the OGL in a sense helped Wizards in the long run because it got people into D&D through other sources. And because of this, when players became accustomed or interested enough within that universe, they would then seek out the original works, games, tabletop, all of that from D&D, and of course Wizards would then make their own money from it. Even Wizards' own competition, like White Wolf Publishing, which makes games like Vampire the Masquerade, they too have made content based on D&D, but again, due to the Open Games license, this is allowed. However, this all came to a rather spicy explosion that you may or may not have heard of. So back in January 2023, a report leaked from Wizards where they were trying to formulate a new plan around the OGL into making it far more controllable within Wizards' own hands internally. Cynthia Williams, the former president of Wizards, was spearheading this, and like I said, in April 2024, she left the company after only 2 years working there. And in recent times, Wizards has lost around 15% stock share almost every single year the past few years, and beyond this, once this report leaked to the D&D fan base, it went over as well as you think it did. Cynthia Williams, the former president, stated that Wizards' brands were under-monetized, and as GeekWire says here, as per the leak, Wizards had considered an update to the Open Games license that would put much more power in Wizards' hands. Under the original OGL, independent creators don't even have to tell Wizards that they're making a D&D product. Under the replacement from the leak, OGL 1.1, the same creators would have suddenly owed Wizards royalties, earning reports, and at least partial licensing rights on any published D&D work, past or present. So pretty much what was happening was, imagine if an artist told the internet, hey, use my music for free, it's not copyrighted, just credit me, and the internet was like, cool, thanks. And then thousands upon thousands of videos, shows, games, whatever, get made using that non-copyrighted music. Then suddenly 10 or 20 years from now, that artist turns around and says, actually, you know what, I changed my mind. You all now owe me royalties from everything you made or are making now. Obviously, this would cause a ruckus and it would piss thousands of people off. Wizards was doing this, but to entire other corporations, indie studios, and the like. They gave the power of fire for free and are now trying to nickel and dime you for a single ember from that sparkling flame. It's disingenuous, and understand why people got really upset about it. It's like trying to put the genie back in the bottle. It's impossible at that point once it's already happened. I mean, just look at some of the initiatives that grew out of Wizards' own hubris and greed, like hashtags and a boycott getting formed around this leak. Then there was another hashtag movement that was also formed as well, and a petition that was made by devs to keep the original OGL in place, which has over 77,000 signatures. Then the makers of Pathfinder assembled over 1,500 other companies who use or rely on that open license to form a new counter license called the Open RPG Creative License and Response. And as you can see here on screen, even more examples as to the fallout of the situation. Eventually, Wizards would create an OGL version called 1.2, which was a playtest version that would change its rules and such based on the feedback of those who use the D&D license for their products. And all of this would then circle back to none other than Kyle Brink himself, the now former executive producer at Wizards of the Coast. He, alongside the president, who left, would be revealed as conspirators at Wizards who worked together to bite down on the use of D&D as an IP across the entire industry. Kyle Brink said this via their blog, and I quickly quote, "What's not in there? There's no royalty payment, no financial reporting, no license back, no registration, no distinction between commercial and non-commercial. Nothing will impact any content you have already published under OGL 1.0. That will always be licensed under OGL 1.0. Your stuff is your stuff. We want an inclusive, safe space for everyone. This is deeply important to us, and OGL 1.0 didn't give us any ability to ensure it." End quote. So if you're having trouble following a bit, the easiest way to explain what's happening here is, if you remember last year, there was this big stink around the Unity engine, where Unity's executives who allowed their engine to be used openly suddenly wanted back-end payments from all previous and future games that were made on Unity. This would eventually go as far as Unity stating that the developer or publisher of a game would have to pay a fee every time their game was downloaded onto someone's preferred platform in order to be installed and played. So yes, This was as stupid as it sounds because it means if any game made in Unity was stirring the pot of controversy, players could, in theory, delete the game and re-download it and delete it over and over again, and every install of that Unity engine game would cost a publisher or developer money. And if thousands of angered customers did this, you can imagine how the fees would skyrocket unnaturally all of a sudden. It was really dumb, and it never came to pass, thankfully. However, what Wizards is doing here is pretty much the same thing. They want the original game license model to exist as it was, so anything made prior to those changes would not be affected, and no fees or anything would need to be paid. But anything new that was being made in the new OGL version would now be placed under this new fee model. And just like the Unity engine situation, clearly everyone just told Wizards to go screw themselves. The fallout of this sudden turn to greed has led to many content creators, companies, and other avenues publicly abandoning Wizards of the Coast and Dungeons & Dragons altogether. And D&D has since in many ways been looked upon like Unity as an engine, a flawed property that now has been stinked with the corporate greed of 1,000 suns. Kyle Brink, like he said in that quote, tried to justify this all by saying that it was being done to turn D&D into an inclusive safe space, and that allowing the ideas and concepts of D&D to be so radically changed all over without corporate oversight made this reality impossible. But I think what Kyle Brink was really saying was that due to the OGL, it meant that D&D as a brand and the many concepts within it could be used by anyone, even those of opposing ideologies like conservatives, which Kyle obviously hates since he is an outspoken liberal yes-man. And likely Wizards realized that if the original OGL stayed in its current form, that their brand, which Wizards has worked tirelessly to change into a more wokeified brand, filling it with nonsense like Mexican orcs, like this post here shows, which pissed everybody off. I mean, come on, it's so dumb. Or how the dwarves were being depicted as gay hipster lovers who baked cookies instead of, smashing monsters' heads in with a hammer. It was very clear that Wizards' view for the future of their brands across the board was diversity, equity, and inclusion above everything else, no matter the cost. And if the OGL stayed the way that it did, not only would they lose their money, but hypothetically, if some conservative-minded creative out there wanted to make their own take on D&D and use its concepts and all of that, and create an alternative to D&D that rejected wokeness, identity politics, and basically make an alternative that was like the old D&D where this kind of stuff didn't matter or really existed. And Wizards likely understood that as such an alternative existed that actually gave legacy players what they wanted from the brand, this could, in turn, ruin their woke D&D future, and there would be nothing they could do technically within legal means to actually stop this from happening. So the likelihood of why Kyle Brink, who again said that white men like him can't leave this hobby soon enough, ended up leaving Wizards, is very likely a combination of his spearheading of this rejection of the original open game license and trying to strangle the creative liberties of thousands of artists and creators out there, because he and those around him were likely terrified of a non-woke alternative spawning out of the ashes that utilizes everything that Wizards owns already. And by the way, if you think you can do better, technically speaking, this offer is still on the table. You could, in theory, still make a non-woke D&D alternative using their creations. That is, if you had the time, talent, and dedication to do it. The other major reason is that Wizards, like many other companies, bloated themselves during the pandemic by overhiring across the board, believing that the demand for their products would excel due to people being home and such. And of course, once the pandemic has subsided for the most part, we're seeing across the board many game studios, publishers, and so on, all cleansing their ranks of people that were hired during those pandemic times. But the fact that the Orc license, which has over 1,500 game development studios and publishers attached to it existing right now, this has created a massive resistance of competition against Wizards when it comes to stuff like D&D and Baldur's Gate in the future. Because Wizards could compete with a few things here and there using their licenses, but when 1,500 studios are now making content like games, books, tabletop, podcasts, shows, you name it, using the licenses for free, and they can all intersect and connect their worlds without Wizards confirmation, by the way, yeah, that's a worrying precedent for Wizards. But the destruction of D&D has been a slow but inevitable conclusion due to the laziness and hubris of Wizards over these past 2 decades and then some. Had they never created or allowed the OGL to exist, they would have absolute reign over their ideas forever. However, on the flip side, you then have to ask if D&D would be as popular as it was if all of those projects and works that were made due to the OGL would even exist, if the OGL never existed to begin with. It's a double-edged sword where no matter how you cut it, you're getting hurt regardless. And through the moronic decisions of a chosen few like Kyle Brink and Cynthia Williams, they've effectively drove the D&D license into the dirt through sheer force of will and desperation. Of course, they are gone now, so could D&D return to prominence and mend the goodwill it once had with so many? Or will they double down amongst new leadership and continue their crusade to ensure the property stays as woke, inclusive, and safe spacey as inhumanly possible? We will see in the future, but this is the current state of D&D right now. A ruined brand led by crazy, out-of-touch people who wanted to suffocate everyone for money and virtue signaling. And now they're left picking up the pieces, and now this brings us to this other story where we now have to talk about Stellar Blade of all things. In case you don't know somehow, Stellar Blade was a big hit for Sony PlayStation and South Korean devs Shift Up. It starred a sexy heroine by the name of Eve who kills weird monsters while looking good doing it. I thoroughly enjoyed the game, I ended up platinuming it and getting everything done within the first week of release. I had a lot of fun with this game, mostly because it rejected a lot of the nonsense that plagues gaming today. There's no multiple genders, no pronouns being stated or anything like that. Stellar Blade was a big win for players, but now it seems worry has taken a hold from that Park Place. After going public, Stellar Blade developer Shift Up seeks employees to publish ESG reports. So recently, developer Shift Up went public for the first time ever and got around $312 million in investments. This has led to Shift Up getting the second highest IPO or initial public offering of investments for a Korean company in the last few years, with PUBG's developer studio Krafton still having the most, which sits at $3.8 billion. My god, dude. Regardless, for a small dev studio like Shift Up to get this much investment this quickly is truly insane and rewarding. However, one user named GigaBear posted on Twitter that amidst the celebration that suspiciously when Shift Up became public, they suddenly were seeking to hire someone to publish ESG reports. If you don't know, ESG or Economic, Social, and Governance is an alternative credit score-like concept that many companies adhere to these days. Your ESG score rises the more you pander to socio-political agendas, like stating how your company has a low carbon footprint, how many people of color are working at your company, or your initiatives that prop up people who have multiple genders or whatever else. The point is that the more you double down, the higher your ESG goes, which then leads to investors who seek out ESG to want to invest in your company, which raises their own ESG, making them more attractive to other companies and investors too. Is this all just one big dick measuring contest amidst people who have too much money to prove who's better than the other person with a lot of money? Yes, absolutely. Like, I'm not even gonna kid with you, that's pretty much it, man. It's just a bunch of rich people trying to out-virtue signal each other. Anyways, now Shift Up is a part of this all, and it has people rightfully wondering if Stellar Blade's sequel and more are going to be officially cooked or not. I would say that it doesn't mean that Stellar Blade or Shift Up will necessarily get screwed over, although yes, this could still happen. I mean, for example, Square Enix also has ESG in their company, and they still release stuff like Final Fantasy XVI, which was the least woke game probably released this entire generation if we're being real. It stars a bunch of European-looking white people with no identity politics or anything like that. Yet that game clearly exists even though, again, like I said, there is ESG investment at Square Enix. I would like to think that Shift Up knows that people bought and supported Stellar Blade because of what it represented. And I would wager based on Shift Up's past, especially the creator of Stellar Blade and the owner of the developer too, whose name is Kim Hwang-tae, that he would very likely be against making his characters uglier or anything like that. I base that not only on Stellar Blade, but other projects that he has worked on in the past creating character designs for, like Magna Carta for example, which is almost 20 years old at this point. Tae is known for his sexualized depictions of female characters, we already know that. And I would hope that this won't change no matter what, especially since Stellar Blade is very obviously championing this very concept. Although if Stellar Blade 2 were to come out and suddenly it's a DEI nightmare and Eve is suddenly a man with fat ankles wearing a face mask, yeah, I would say they're cooked at that point, and Shift Up will likely lose all of their money and close down because ain't nobody buying that nonsense. But I do like to think that some of these companies and development studios have some sort of brains behind them. And when it comes to Stellar Blade, it would just be flat out moronic to go the modern audience route with a franchise like this, just beyond stupid. Like, come on, dude. And also, we need to realize that ESG does not equal good business. Even back in 2022, from the Harvard Business Review, they said, and I quote, "To begin with, ESG funds certainly perform poorly in financial terms. In a recent Journal of Finance paper, University of Chicago researchers analyzed the Morningstar sustainability rates of more than 20,000 mutual funds representing over $8 trillion of investor savings. Although the highest rated funds in terms of sustainability certainly attracted more capital than the lowest rated funds, none of the high sustainability funds outperformed any of the lowest rated funds. ESG funds don't seem to deliver better ESG performance either. Researchers at Columbia University and London School of Economics compared the ESG record of US companies in 147 ESG funded portfolios and that of US companies in 2,428 non-ESG portfolios. They found that the companies in the ESG portfolios had worse compliance records for both labor and environmental rules. They also found that companies added to ESG portfolios did not subsequently improve compliance with labor or environmental regulations. ESG targets may actually distort decision making." End quote. So based on this knowledge, we know that ESG for the most part doesn't actually better anything at all. Instead, it actually just makes everything worse, and it is simply, like I said before, a dick measuring contest between out-of-touch rich people basically. So there's a few scenarios here. Either one, Shift Up is cooked and Stellar Blade is over and done, fellas, and we'll get modern audience into oblivion. Or two, they give ESG reports and try to dance around what these investors want while still giving the players what they really want, meaning that they win both sides. Personally, I think Shift Up will do the second, but time will only tell since it is obviously too early, and I would only start to panic once I see more information get revealed about the internal workings of the studio, and especially once we see images or a trailer for Stellar Blade 2 in the future. If Eve comes out in the sequel trailer looking like an overweight lunch lady, then yeah, we'll talk about that when it comes. But I think it's far too early to get too scared just yet, because like I said, despite ESG companies can still technically do what they want to do if they choose to. It's just that too many of them get caught up in the nonsense and lose sight of the bigger picture far too often. So don't worry too much about Shift Up yet, don't write them off until we see more, at least they're not as bad as Wizards of the Coast yet anyways. So I don't want to end this video on some doom and gloom, so chins up everyone, stay positive, and try to look at the bigger picture. If Final Fantasy XVI can exist amidst ESG, I think a non-woke Stellar Blade 2 can as well. As for Wizards, they are morons of the highest caliber, and they deserve the bet that they've made at this point. If you want to screw with the livelihoods of thousands of dev studios and the expectations of players the world over, well, you get what you deserve. Will Wizards turn it around now that Kyle and Cynthia are gone? Honestly, probably not. I can only see them doubling or tripling down in the future, to be real with you, but that's what I got for you today. Let me know what you think as always. Have a wonderful day and thank you for watching. Subscribe, share, like the video. Thanks to my patrons, and remember that memberships are also now live, and I'll see you in the next one.